President Biden is making what he calls a moral case for protecting the fundamental right of Americans to vote.
In America, if you lose, you accept the results. You follow the Constitution. You try again. You don't call facts fake and then try to bring down the American experiment just because you're unhappy. That's not statesmanship. That's not democracy. It's a denial of the right to vote. It suppresses, it subjugates. The denial of full and free and fair election is the most un-American thing that any of us can imagine. The 21st century Jim Crow assault is real. It's unrelenting. And we're going to challenge it vigorously.
The speech on voting rights comes as a handful of Republican-led legislatures are moving to restrict them. It poses a dilemma for the White House. Just how much can the federal government do to counteract what it believes are detrimental policies on the state level? Meanwhile, members of Congress are continuing their push to pass a bipartisan infrastructure bill. But some Republicans are expressing concerns over how the plan is funded. We'll have more on lawmakers' two-track infrastructure hopes in a moment. Plus, after dozens of failed legal challenges and recounts in several states, the fallout from former President Trump's baseless claims of widespread election fraud continues. Lawyers for Mr. Trump could be facing discipline for their roles in attempting to overturn the 2020 election. Attorneys Sidney Powell and Lynn Wood faced questions from a federal judge during a hearing in Michigan Monday. It comes after the state of New York and Washington, D.C. suspended the law licenses of former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani. A committee of judges determined the former president's personal attorney had, quote, communicated demonstrably false and misleading statements to courts, lawmakers, and the public at large. Here's an example of what they mean.
If you count the lawful votes, Trump won Wisconsin by a good margin. Indeed, if you count the lawful votes in Pennsylvania, he won it by about 300,000 votes. All you got to do to find out if I'm misleading you at all is to look at the lawsuits.
The Washington Post uncovered emails from a top lawyer for the Republican Party, Justin Reimer. In correspondence from last November, Reimer called the fraud claims a joke and accused the Trump legal team of, quote, misleading millions of people who have wishful thinking that the president is going to somehow win this thing. For more, let's bring in Caitlin Huey-Burns, Eugene Scott, and Nandita Bose. Caitlin is CBSN's Washington reporter. Eugene is a national political reporter for The Washington Post. And Nandita is a White House correspondent for Reuters. Welcome. It's good to have you all. Nandita, let's talk about voting rights. On Monday, dozens of Texas Democratic lawmakers fled to Washington, D.C., trying to block the passage of new voting restrictions. You interviewed Vice President Harris, who is meeting with those lawmakers. What's next here?
So I did get a chance to speak to Vice President Harris today, and she was full of praise for the Texas Democrats who left the state on Monday. She really spoke a lot about kind of the coalition that they are trying to build around the country, with activists and advocates and members of the business community. But in terms of actual, pieces of legislation that can be moved forward, there were, not many details around that. And we did also see that with the president's speech. He said it's a national imperative to pass the legislation. He made a searing critique of efforts that are underway to block voting rights. But there was very little in terms of actual next steps that this White House and this administration can take.
Well, Caitlin, you've covered a lot of these proposed and enacted voting restrictions. Ultimately, which has more impact on voting policy, state or federal laws?
Well, elections are conducted at the state level. That's why we have a patchwork of different laws throughout the country. And that was, more pronounced during the pandemic, as a lot of these states were trying to figure out how to get people to vote safely and securely in a pandemic. So you have elections are conducted at the state level. Democrats are arguing for federal legislation, however, because of what's happening in these state legislatures, where you have in states that are run mostly by Republicans pushing forward with voting reforms, some of which are pretty restrictive. They're able to pass those measures at the state level, and that's why you've seen Democrats really argue for this federal legislation in the form of H.R. 1 or S1, that really broad sweeping proposal. And they're also pushing for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which would essentially restore a provision that was struck down in the original Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court in 2013, which said that states with a history of discrimination had to get federal approval to change their voting laws. So when that was struck down by the Supreme Court, that enables a lot of these states really to kind of go it alone and not have to seek federal approval to change some of their laws. So a state like Georgia, for example, is one example of that. Republicans, however, say that this legislation that is being talked about in Congress is akin to a federal takeover of a state function, and so they are very much opposed to the policy. The base of the party is certainly being driven by the former president's false claims about the election that is certainly fueling most of this, and the president addressed that today. But in terms of the policy, that's kind of how Republicans are arguing this. So Democrats are saying that, look, we need this federal legislation because of what's happening in the states, and Republicans are pretty united against it.
Well, Eugene, let me ask you about the filibuster. It remains a big obstacle for the White House to pass federal voting rights legislation, though Democrats don't have the votes to get past that. What is Congressman Jim Clyburn's proposed workaround?
Well, he has suggested that the White House, directly talking to President Biden, be more aggressive in getting rid of the filibuster and making it possible for his agenda to move forward with fewer votes, given that the Democrats have the 50 representatives in Senate, or at least 50 votes usually. And we know that Vice President Harris will be able to break a tie if that is possible. But the Biden White House has not been very clear in terms of whether or not they want to accept what Clyburn is encouraging. And in fact, Biden has largely dodged questions about whether or not he is going to move forward in a direction that Clyburn and other Democratic lawmakers think is best. We know that Biden has historically been a huge proponent of bipartisanship and believing that he can work with people on the other side of the aisle to get this moving forward. And today in his speech, we saw him pretty much repeat the strategy that he believes has been effective with past legislation, which has motivate Americans to encourage their lawmakers to vote differently to support the ideas that they believe are best. Whether or not that will actually happen, it's not yet clear, but it's certainly something that Biden probably is going to continue to lean into.
Well, Caitlin, I know you've been speaking with activists who've been watching this very closely about voting rights legislation. How are they interpreting President Biden's moves on this?
Well, disappointed and concerning is how one activist put it to me earlier today after watching Biden's speech on this, because he did not mention anything about the filibuster. And talking to advocates today, or activists who are, trying to push the president to, advocate for some kind of change when it comes to the filibuster in order to get voting rights passed, a lot of their reaction has been that, yes, a lot of this rhetoric that the president is talking about and highlighted today with this, pretty fiery speech in Philadelphia and the symbolism around it, they say, look, that's great, but if those actions, if your actions don't match your rhetoric, then what are we really doing here? And so you have a lot of activists who have been pushing the president to advocate for some kind of change to the filibuster, whether it's a kind of a carve out for voting rights in particular, whether it's, some kind of change. They say that the speech today just really didn't hit those points. You're going to continue to see that pressure because they believe that legislation is the only thing that really has the teeth here. And earlier today when Biden was speaking, he said, well, legislation isn't the only route, and talked about what the DOJ can do and some other kind of things around the edges, or, obviously making this a campaign issue in 2022. But people who have been focused on this issue say legislation is really where the teeth are. And if you don't have the votes, if you can't get past the filibuster, you can't pass this legislation. So that's something to kind of continue to watch here, is that as much as Biden, starts to get engaged on this issue, is it really enough for people that want to see him do more? And as we've mentioned before, talking to lawmakers on Capitol Hill, and Democrats have expressed to me that they are concerned about the impact on the midterms if they go back to their constituents and people who voted for them and say, look, we weren't able to get this stuff done because of the filibuster. They think that that's going to have a real dampening effect on Democratic base turnout. So there is some worry about kind of how this all plays in terms of Democrats and the midterm election. There is some concern there.
Right. I mean, it really is, we're not that far off. And so you have sort of a myriad of factors, it sounds like, when it comes to what it is the White House might be weighing here or considering as they decide on next steps when it comes to voting rights. All right, switching gears, Eugene, bipartisan negotiators meet Tuesday to discuss infrastructure. How are the president and Democrats balancing holding on to fragile Republican support while offering something the Manchin and Sanders wings of the party will actually sign on to?
Well, it seems like the number of Democrats who actually do support a two-step process, one moving forward with infrastructure, following the advice and leadership of the bipartisan mixed group of senators is one lane, but also taking a path where the more liberal agenda items related to child care and climate change and some of these core values of the Democratic Party can be passed. It's also an approach that you see Democratic lawmakers like Schumer and obviously people in the base in the House advocating for. And it seems as if like there could be more support for that coming from the White House as a way to appease people, on the right who have expressed real concern about funding going towards more liberal issues that perhaps are not traditionally thought of when mentioning infrastructure, as well as addressing those very important issues to Democratic voters that lead to a broader and more expansive understanding of infrastructure that have not gotten the amount of support that many Democrats would have liked to see Republican lawmakers provide.
Well, Nandita, new data from the Labor Department shows inflation rising at its fastest pace since 2008. How much of a liability could this be for President Biden and his agenda?
This could actually be something that, creates a lot of panic. Consumer prices are high at their highest level in 13 years. And Reuters did speak to a senior White House official after the data came out, and this official was keen on kind of talking about how inflationary pressures are likely to decrease in the short to medium term, but did not really talk about putting a time frame on it. So they did acknowledge that this is going to be a challenge, but they did not want to talk about any sort of time frame related to that. And they also noted that some of the inflationary pressures created by supply chain bottlenecks tied to lumber or chips that the White House has been spending a lot of time on are likely to ease going forward. But they also noted that there is a lot of spending coming back, after the economy recovers from the pandemic, travel-related spending, for example. There's also a shortage in the housing market, And that's kind of creating a shortage of supply in the housing market. That's creating inflationary pressures as well. And then there is the pandemic as well. The risk of fast-spreading variants. Hubs that are where people are not vaccinated. So there are a lot of headwinds that remain. And the White House acknowledges them, but they are not willing to say anything more than some of these pressures are likely to come down in the near term, and that is all they want to say on this.
Well, Caitlin, the events of January 6th continue to shape so much of the discourse between Republicans and Democrats. This past March, the former acting U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C., Michael Sherwin, told 60 Minutes he believed evidence in the Capitol riot pointed to sedition for some defendants. To date, no one has been charged with that. What do you see as the potential political ramifications if none of these hundreds of cases gets a charge as serious as sedition?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, especially since when senators were debating on whether to support this commission, you heard a lot from Republicans that, in their opposition to supporting a bipartisan commission on this, they said, look, the justice system is handling this just fine. Committees in Congress are handling this just fine. Let them do their work. Let's not interfere. Democrats who were supportive of the commission, essentially were making the argument, well, that's just not enough here. We need to really get to the bottom and have a more thorough investigation into this. So you could kind of see the fault lines develop along those lines. And to your point about this, the political fallout for Republicans just really hasn't really been there. You've actually seen some Republicans on Capitol Hill downplay what happened on January 6th. There has been an attempt to really try to move beyond this because they don't want to focus on this heading into the midterm elections, and they've really not had a lot of consequences for this. A big question will be how this plays in the midterms and whether this is still on people's minds in the midterms. Republicans are betting that it's not, and they're trying to make it not an issue. The question, however, is going to be, whether McCarthy ends up appointing more Republicans to this now select committee in Congress, and which Republicans he appoints, whether there's an attempt to kind of to change the trajectory of that select committee remains to be seen. But this is why Democrats have been arguing for a committee, and we'll see kind of how both sides try to play this up or downplay this heading into next year.
Nandita, I want to turn to geopolitics for a moment. We've seen protests escalating in Haiti, South Africa, Taiwan, and Cuba. How is the White House responding, and what else are they considering at this point?
That's a really interesting question, kind of looking at a lot of these countries together. In Haiti, as you're, aware, the president was assassinated. The country has made a formal request for more troops. The White House has said so far that they're considering that request, but they haven't really made any commitments. Any more commitments on that issue. Same thing with Cuba. The president has come out and talked about, how people on the ground have a right to protest, and that he supports that. And people in Cuba are protesting food shortages, medicine shortages. They want the dictatorship, the 62-year-old dictatorship in the country to end. But the president hasn't really talked about, or the White House hasn't talked about any sort of change in policy towards the country. Sanctions that were imposed under the Trump administration. The country was called a state sponsor of terrorism. Some of these designations, can be done away with. But again, the White House has not weighed in on the issue beyond saying that they support what the people in some of these countries are doing or asking for. And it kind of also gives you a flavor of sort of, this hands-off sort of foreign policy approach that we're sort of slowly and steadily seeing from this White House. We saw that a little bit with Afghanistan in the past few weeks. We're seeing that with Haiti. We're seeing that with Cuba. And it really will be, fascinating to see how some of these strands kind of develop over the next few weeks.
Yeah, we'll certainly be paying close attention to that. Finally, Eugene, the Washington Post has new reporting about top RNC lawyer Justin Reimer responding to accusations of disloyalty. What is behind that accusation?
Well, what is at the heart of that accusation is Reimer calling out Republican lawyers or Trump defenders, as we saw Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, Lynn Wood, for putting forward false statements about the election that haven't been rooted in fact and that, quite frankly, are leaving all of them in serious legal trouble. We saw that Reimer just had no problem saying that these myths that are being put forward are misleading Trump loyalists, conservative voters, and even some Americans who've been paying attention and giving these statements and individual spokespeople their ear, even if they haven't, leaned into the arguments that they're putting forward. And we know that as we move forward, we could see more proof coming from courts and investigations and other outlets proving that so much of what these Trump defenders have articulated over the past several months is just really not rooted in fact, and that what Reimer is accusing them of is actually quite true.
All right, Caitlin Huey-Burns, Eugene Scott, and Nandita Bose, thanks to you all. Really appreciate it.